then what we'll do is when we get to the end, then perhaps we can make sure that that's a lot more interactive, or maybe Jo can sort of collect up the questions and we can ask them and do a sort of question and answer thing at the end. Okay, so I'll get started. So the aims of the session really are to sort of give you an overview of the sensory systems and how they work together, to give you an understanding and an awareness of sensory processing difficulties, how that impacts on a child or adult's function or their behaviour, and hopefully to give you some strategies to try at home. I'm just going to take my jumper off. I knew as soon as I started talking I'd get warm, which is
don't want to be warm.
Always happens. Should have preempted that one. Okay, so sensory processing difficulties are basically, it's not rocket science, it's quite straightforward. It's basically your ability to take in, sort out and process and make sense of whatever sensory input is coming in from around you. So an easy example is you hear a noise, you think, what is that noise? What does it mean? What do I need to do? And you respond in the right way. Okay, so we're not talking about people who have got a hearing impairment or a visual impairment or any other kind of sensory impairment. There's nothing wrong as such with the physical part of the sense. It's more about the processing. So the key thing is having the right response to the stimulus. So it's what we call the adaptive response. So for example, say when I'm doing a training in a room full of 30 people and someone's phone ring, we all think, oh, what's that noise? Oh, it's someone's phone. Oh, I'm glad it's not mine. Let me put mine on silent, and you carry on. That would be the normal response. If somebody ran outside the room in a panic because of that noise, that would be the wrong response. Okay, so that it's not that there's a problem with the hearing, but it's the wrong response. And they're the kind of things we see a lot in children, that there might be a noise that we know doesn't mean danger, but to the child they might perceive that as such and react accordingly. Okay, so how many senses have you got? Anything in the chat? Or I'll have to leave it to you, Jo, to tell me how many senses do you have? You might know though.
Is it 5? I should count your presentation.
No, this slide is terrible because one's missing at the moment. So yeah, we start off with 5. Okay, I don't know what's happened to this slide. I think from cutting and pasting it from another presentation, something went wrong. There we go. Okay, so you've got your 5 senses that we all know about. It's quite easy to understand when a person has a sensory processing difficulty in any of these areas, because it's quite obvious to see. You know, you'll have children who cover their ears, who don't like loud noise. You'll have children who are very fussy eaters if they've got issues around taste. You have children who don't like touching messy play if they've got difficulties around touch, for example. So it's quite easy to recognise these difficulties, and you don't necessarily need an OT to come and tell you that. It's, you know, it's fairly obvious. Any advance on 5?
Well, Wade did say 6.
Okay, there's actually, until fairly recently, OTs have always talked about the 7 senses, but actually we're now talking about 8. So we have, it's not a new one, it's just we've always kind of combined it in with one of the 7. So even if you learn nothing else tonight, you'll learn that you've got 8 senses. And actually I find that this is the really key thing, because people don't know these senses exist. They can't understand the behaviour that we're seeing in the children. So as soon as you understand, for example, if you didn't know about your auditory sense, you would wonder why a child has got their hands on their ears and they're screaming every time there's a loud noise. You wouldn't be able to make sense of it. So once you know about the other 3 senses, hopefully a lot of the kind of issues that some of your children might be having will become a bit clearer. Okay, so the 5 you know, and then you've got 3 more from inside your body. The third one's so new that I haven't even drawn a Mr. Man for it. So, okay, so you have your proprioceptive sense, your vestibular sense, and your interoceptive sense. I have sent these slides across to Jo and Wei, so you can have a copy so you don't have to worry about taking too many notes. Okay, so your proprioceptive sense it's your unconscious awareness of your body position. So it's the sense that tells you where you are in space, and sort of how close you are to people. So things like people with sensory processing difficulties and autism not having a very good understanding of their own personal space is often linked with this sense, because it's really hard to have an awareness of how close you are to somebody else if you haven't got an idea of your own, where your body is. Okay, so I can't see your faces, so I don't know your reactions to this, but I find a really good example of proprioception is, anyone ever had a few too many glasses of wine or a few too many pints of beer? I'm sure that's not happened very often, but perhaps next time that happens, just think about, use it as a learning, it's a bit of homework. Normally we move around automatically. We don't even think about it. If you're on your third glass of wine, you might get up and you might knock your shoulder on the door frame, for example. You're just a little bit less coordinated than normal, which is fine. Most of the time you can hide that from people by increasing your concentration. So you have to really concentrate on your movement in order to not be clumsy. Does that make sense to anyone? So things like putting a key in the door, normally that's fine, but if you've had a few drinks, you might have to use your vision and you'll have to hold on and you have to use all your other senses at the same time. So that's quite an easy one to remember, in that you can continue to have good body awareness as long as you concentrate on it. So lots of our children, if they're not concentrating on what they're doing, can be really clumsy. So some children, they can, if they're talking to you and walking at the same time, they're much more likely to trip over a piece of fluff. So that's your proprioceptive sense. It tells you also about how much force is required. And generally, it's harder and requires more control to be gentle than it does to be rough. So lots of our children who are a bit heavy-handed, bull in a china shop, those kind of sayings that people use, that's often related to that proprioceptive sense. And it's called your grading of movement. And again, going back to the alcohol analogy, if you've had too much, you might tip that glass a little bit too much and dribble a bit down your chin. And that is typical of difficulty grading your movement. So the child, that we would never give them the jug to fill up their own water, because they would just tip the whole jug. There would be no slow, controlled grading. Is this all making sense to people at the moment? Okay, so it should be totally automatic. We shouldn't have to think about it. But often the children with proprioceptive difficulties do have to think about it, and they have to rely on their other senses as well. So they're relying on their visual sense to be aware of sort of where they are in relation to other people. What also happens is you get children who engage in lots and lots of movement activity, because it comes through your muscles and joints. If you're still, your proprioceptive sense is really not getting any information. So by fidgeting, moving, doing a lot of movement activity, you're feeding that proprioceptive sense. So this covers all the children who find it very difficult to sit still. Home learning has been a nightmare because they're bouncing around the room the whole time. Lots of fidgeting, that kind of thing as well. Okay, so that's your proprioceptive sense, and that's why the little Mr. Man has got his weights, because it's a muscles and joints. So remember, muscles and joints. So children who have got low muscle tone, or lower than sort of the lower end of the average range. So lots of the children who might have a diagnosis of something like dyspraxia may well have difficulties with proprioception. Children with Down syndrome will have lower muscle tone, so they will have proprioceptive difficulties. Hypermobility of the joints is quite a common issue that we see. Now, if a child has got hypermobility and the proprioceptive sense goes in through their muscles and joints, they're probably going to have proprioceptive difficulties as well. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm presuming this is sort of, everyone can hear me okay, Jo?
Yeah,
okay.
All good.
Right, your next one is your vestibular sense. This is your sense of balance and movement. So it's really closely linked to that proprioceptive sense. It's really hard to pull them apart, but this is much more about your balance and movement. So knowing whether you're moving, and we obviously use our vision a lot for that. So often we don't realise that children have got problems with their vestibular sense because they walk around with their eyes open, and it's only when we ask them to close their eyes that we have problems. So sometimes a child that's really frightened of the dark at night might well be because their vestibular system is really poor and they don't know where they are when the light's off. And equally, if their body awareness is poor, their poor proprioception, they're not going to be able to find their way to the bathroom just by their body awareness. Most people can find their way to their own bathroom in the dark because you know roughly it's 3 steps to the door, the handle's about there. Whereas if you've got proprioception and vestibular problems, that's going to be really hard. So the other, another example of vestibular is if you're sitting in your car or you're sitting on a train and you're stationary and the train and the other platform moves and you're convinced you've moved, okay? That feeling that or if you're sitting in the car, you put your foot on the brake, you're not moving, but your vision has fooled your vestibular system, so your body has felt like you've moved, okay? I'm going to do a quick activity. Now, obviously, I can't see any of you, so I'd like you to try it if you can. All I want you to do is stand up, make sure you're not leaning on anything, and then just close your eyes for about 10 seconds and just feel what's happening, okay? I'm hoping no one's fallen over. Okay, sit back down again, thank you. What happened? Anybody answer?
Anyone want to go on the chat and tell me what happened for them? I can tell you what happened to me. I felt like I was moving, swaying.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So what that is that's to show. Sorry. That's to show that you've got, it's an internal thing, you're not aware of it, it's an internal system. And so when you started to lean a bit too far forward, your vestibular sense is the thing that put you back in line. And then if you went backwards a little bit, it put you back in line again. So it's just to show that it's an internal thing, you're not aware of it. So people who've got vestibular problems would have really struggled with that because taking the vision away would have been a real difficulty. So that was just a sort of a bit of an example, really. So it's really linked with coordination. Lots of children who've had things like grommets, difficulties with their hearing or inner ear infections, that kind of thing, can have vestibular problems because it's all located in the inner ear. I'm not going to go into any more technical detail than that. But that explains why if you've got a high temperature or a nasty cold, you can feel quite dizzy. If you go and pick up a pen that you've dropped on the floor, you get that woozy head rush feeling. And so some of the children who have got a sensitive vestibular system can feel like that a lot of the time. So the children with vestibular difficulties are the ones that may well avoid things. So avoid lots of movement activity, particularly things like fairground rides. Obviously, there's other issues with those. Often children don't like them because of the noise and the crowds. It's not actually the ride itself. Children who get excessively car sick as well. With all the senses, you have two extremes, sort of the normal in the middle and the two extremes. So the other children were the ones who seek out vestibular information. So the children that love to spin, never get dizzy, could be on a swing for hours and hours and your arms are tired from pushing them. That's the kind of child that may be more of a vestibular sensory seeker. Okay. Right, so really crucial in terms of motor development. It's also very closely linked to eye movements. Okay, hopefully the technical stuff's nearly over. How are we doing for time? Okay, the last sense, your eighth sense, which we used to talk about in terms of being your internal proprioception, is actually called your interoception. So this system is the one that gives you information about what's going on inside your body. So it's your ability to notice the signal from inside your body and connect that body signal to the right meaning. So for example, if you've got a funny feeling in your tummy, how do we know that that is because you need a wee, you need a poo, you're terrified, or you've got butterflies, or you're really hungry? That's the one that tells you that. So it's your interoceptive system that tells you what that inside feeling means. So often children have some real difficulties with those things. So these kind of things. So recognizing you're hungry, recognizing you're thirsty. So some children would go all day without having a drink, and they'll come home from school with a full water bottle, even if it's really hot, and they might actually be really dehydrated, but they don't recognize that they're thirsty. So they'll need reminding. Same with being hungry. Other children, on the other hand, don't constantly drink and constantly eat. They just don't feel that they're full. They don't feel that feeling of fullness. Another common one is processing pain. So obviously, if it's an internal pain, something like a toothache or a tummy ache, people can be quite poor at recognizing those. So you only know the child is ill is when they've got a raging, terrible temperature, and the dentist will say, wow, this is a really nasty tooth infection. How did they cope with it? But they might not have recognised it. Some of the more common things as well is recognising whether you're hot or cold. So children that will go out in the snow in a t-shirt, and then the child that has got 3 fleeces on and is red in the face and overheating, but haven't recognised that they need to take their top off. Okay. Does that all make sense, those 3 senses? Okay, so you've got your 8 senses, and the sensory same with everything. It's a big broad spectrum, and at one end you've got the undersensitive child. So if you're undersensitive to any of the senses, you're going to require more information, more stimulation to respond. Okay, and then at the other extreme you've got the, oh, it says internet unstable. The other extreme, you've got the hypersensitive child who a little bit of stimulation seems like too much. So they're the ones that tend to avoid. So you've got, obviously I'm talking about children very, very sort of in a very basic way of the children who are seeking out and the children who are avoiding. Most children actually fall somewhere in the middle, and it changes as well. So their perception can vary during the day, during the week, depending on where they are. So this sometimes causes a bit of confusion, because some people say, well, they can't have sensory issues, it's fine in my class. And that's quite a common thing, because there are so many things that a child needs to be in totally the right place for their sensory systems to work properly. If any of us, I'm presuming that we don't have sensory issues, if any of us are feeling really stressed and anxious or overtired or not very well, then our sensory systems get overloaded a lot more quickly than normal. So my thing usually is noise. If I'm stressed, I just need peace and quiet, and I'll tell my son off having the TV on too loud, and actually it's the same volume as normal. It's just, to me, it's just like, that's the bit that's winding me up. So if you think about, if a child needs lots of consistency and routine and structure and likes things to be a certain way, and if not they get anxious, then that's hardly surprising that certain situations are more difficult for them. If they're in a situation that is more anxiety provoking, their sensory difficulties are going to be much harder to manage and much harder to control, which is why all of the classic things about keeping routine, keeping structure, keeping the environmental stuff to reduced as much as possible can really help. So it can be the same classroom, but if it's a supply teacher who doesn't understand, what hasn't put up the cues for the day, or just does things in a different way, that child may really not be able to cope with that. And often you find the difference between home and school can be quite marked. You have the children that their sensory issues present much more severely at school because the environment is so overwhelming and they cannot control their difficulties, and it becomes, the noise is too much, they can't focus, they get angry quickly, they become really upset very quickly. And then you get the other children who manage somehow to hold it together at school, and then as soon as they get out of school, then they explode. It's a bit like you're shaking a Coke bottle all day, and as soon as they get home, the cork comes out, and all of the behaviour and everything that's built up during the day comes out when they're feeling safe at home. So you can have the same sensory difficulties but very different presentations. Has anyone got any questions at the moment? So sip.
No, nothing at the moment, but that's really clear.
Okay. Right, let's keep going then. Okay, so one of the big things we have is a difficulty with is what's called sensory modulation. So that's the ability to kind of adapt. It's not the sensory processing as such. The sensory processing is what's that noise? What does that mean? Is that touch something I can cope with? The sensory modulation is more about adapting and coping with that information. So being able to listen. So obviously, I usually do this in a big group setting. People know, that you're meant to be listening to me, not the motorbike that's just gone past outside, or not the buzz of that computer or the sound from down the corridor. It's being able to take in the relevant information, and that's something that people often have difficulty with in a noisy environment or busy visual environment. How does the child know that the most important bit of visual information in that classroom is looking at the slides that the teacher is showing. It might be that the teacher's got a really nice pattern top on and that's really interesting and the child's got lost in the pattern, or it might be that the classroom is really, really busy visually. So particularly if you think of a typical reception class with everyone's birthday, all the alphabet, all the numbers, all games, everything all over the place, that classroom is so visually appealing, but it's really hard to know actually what bit that you should be paying attention to. So it's that being able to filter out the right thing. And sensory filtering is something that's really difficult, because if you've got a sensory processing difficulty, generally your senses are almost working too well. They're too good. You've got too much information going in. So I often say to children, what can you hear right now? And they'll mention 7 or 8 or 9 things that I can't even hear. You know, it might be just really the photocopier in the office down the corridor and you can't hear it. And the teacher says, well, there was no trigger for him getting upset, but actually that's because we filter it all out. If it's our brain goes, what's that new noise? Oh, that's fine, doesn't mean anything, and you stop hearing it. That's how how you should be. But a lot of the children I see, they go, what's that noise? What's that noise? What's that noise? And it just keeps going all the time. So it's really it's really hard for them to actually be able to focus on the right thing, and certainly for the duration of the lesson, for example. Okay, so in order for the sensory processing and the sensory modulation, those are really key to helping regulate yourself. If you keep getting alerted by things that you shouldn't be alerted by, how can you stay calm? It's really hard to keep yourself on that sort of even keel if you're constantly being triggered by things. So with your sort of self-regulation, you've got your internal regulation. So these are the things we talked about in terms of your interoception. So, you know, feeling hungry, feeling thirsty. You know, a child might actually have low blood sugar, and that's why they're not concentrating, because they haven't recognised that they were thirsty or hungry and they haven't eaten, for example. Or a child might have a really nasty tummy ache because they haven't been to the toilet. Or you've got a child that is constantly thinking, should I ask to go to the toilet now? Because I don't know if I actually need to go or not. Am I going to wet myself? That's another, I didn't mention that in terms of the interoception. Recognising the need for the toilet is a big, big issue. So often with normal interoception, we know that, oh yeah, I could go about 2 hours. I could get in the car and drive for a couple of hours without needing the toilet, or I need to go in about half an hour, or we very rarely get to that state where it's, oh, I need to go now. Whereas a lot of the children with the poor interoception, they don't get that message until it's really, really strong. So they get it that I need to go now. So a child putting their hands up to go to the toilet and being told to wait till the end of the lesson is not a good thing. Okay, and then the emotional regulation, the other side of things is all of, you know, the frustration, the anxiety, the getting bored very quickly, getting very easily distracted, embarrassment, all of those kind of things. So it all feeds into a lot of those behavioural things. Okay, I'm going to go past these. So now I'm going to try and sort of talk a little bit more about strategies. I mean, hopefully, as we've been going, you can tell I've been talking about sensory strategies in things like the environment, so making sure the environment's a bit less overwhelming. But the key thing if you've got some kind of sensory presentation, some kind of sensory behaviour going on that you recognise is a sensory behaviour, you've got to be very careful about trying to stop that. So lots of people will try and stop something that maybe isn't the most appealing kind of behaviour, or even if it's distracting for somebody else. So somebody repeatedly sort of flapping or jumping up and down is obviously going to be distracting to the rest of the class. But what we need to remember is that sensory behaviour, the child is engaging in that because they need to. We may not understand why they need to, but it's serving a purpose for them. So if you stop that behaviour happening and the child still needs that input, whatever it might be, they're going to find another way of doing it. And that might be less desirable than what they were doing in the first place. So we need to really sort of try and think of that and give appropriate strategies. And if the child has got a sensory need, we need to allow them to sort of fulfil that sensory need and to engage in whatever activity that we might need to shape it a little bit to be a bit more appropriate for the situation. But things like stimming behaviour, there's quite a few approaches, ABA being one of them, that that expects stimming should be stopped. Now, stimming, to me, stimming is a sensory behaviour. It's a sensory regulation, and often when you see stimming behaviours is either when the child is really excited or when they're becoming really anxious. So they're either doing it as an expression of their pleasure, which there can't be anything wrong with that, surely. And then but the other side of it is that they're showing it when they're anxious. So increasing things like rocking or chewing, or even biting their fist, those kind of things, they're all signs that a child is anxious. So we should be supporting the anxiety, not stopping the behaviour. Okay. I'm very aware that I'm trying to cover about 3 hours worth in 20 minutes. Okay, so the next few slides are just that I've picked a few from different presentations. So if I go through this, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go through all of them, and then we'll see about questions at the end. So some practical strategies for home. One of the first things is obviously being a sensory detective is the first one. So knowing your child. So have a think about those 8 senses and try and, whether you've seen an OT or you've had an OT assessment or not, just try and, even if you just write down each sense and think, hold on, what goes in this sense? Actually, yeah, he's really fussy with food. He doesn't like anything with lumps in. He doesn't like any sauces. He likes things very plain. Now that could be a tactile thing. It could be to do with the feeling of the food in the mouth, or it could be to do with the taste, or it could be to do with the smell. So just try and think about your child and what sensory bit do you think might be the cause of the problem you're having. So if a child is say being very fussy, or if a child doesn't like if your child hates the shower but loves the bath, what is that? Is it the feeling of the water? Again, it could be a tactile issue, and the fact that the bath is calming and soothing, whereas a shower is alerting. So some children find that almost painful. So obviously I know you're not going to know all the details, but just try and think about your behaviours and be a bit of a sensory detective. So think, okay, what senses do you think this is being sort of contributing to this? Consider your environment and reduce the distractions. This is something that I say a lot to schools, because schools are generally really overwhelming. And that's one of the reasons why sort of more autism specific classes tend to be quite plain, and people go in and go, oh, this isn't a very welcoming classroom, but actually that is really welcoming for those children in that class, because they can actually focus on the learning, not all the other bits that are put up for Ofsted inspectors and to look at. So things like using visual cues, having a consistent structure, having a consistent routine. Obviously, they're all sort of things that might be deemed as autism specific, but they're not autism specific, they're sensory specific. So if you know what's going on, what's happening and what's expected of you, then you're going to feel a lot less anxious. And the less anxious you are, the less likely your sensory difficulties are going to cause a problem. So if you're feeling really settled, then your sensory issues are going to be at the sort of the lowest, if you see what I mean. We talk about senses in terms of a threshold. So generally the children that I see who have sensory difficulties, their threshold for input is really, really low. So it's a bit like pressing your buttons. You know, at the end of the day, your children can press less buttons for you to lose your rag. Whereas at the beginning of the day, you're a lot more patient. Whereas if you think that's how we feel, a lot of our children, they've hardly got any buttons to press at all before they they tip over the edge. Okay. I'm getting thirsty now. My interoception works. Okay. Increased movement activities. That's a given, basically. A lot of the time, proprioceptive input, which is what you get through movement, so using your muscles and joints, works in so many ways. It works in regulating people if they're getting a bit overwhelmed and a bit upset. It works in helping people to focus if they're starting to switch off and get sleepy. And then it helps people who are trying to focus and they're trying to increase their movement. So the children who are really, really fidgety. So it works in lots of ways, and it's good for your mood as well. So things like, if you want your child to sit at the mealtime for 10-15 minutes rather than 2 minutes and keep running off, then think about doing a movement activity first. So you've fed their muscles and joints, and then you've given them enough proprioceptive input for them to be able to sit still for about 10 minutes before they start to need to get that input again. So that's often a really successful thing. If you need a child to sit still for anything, just do some really intense movement first. It's often the hardest thing for this is the child that isn't keen on movement. So, but that's probably more of a vestibular thing. And if a child really dislikes movement, then you really do need to be seeing an OT about that. So increased movement activity is, think about that being stable and feeding those muscles and joints. So a child who's sitting on an adult dining chair and their feet are dangling, they're getting no proprioceptive feedback through their feet from the floor to give them that stability. So we can't expect them to sit still and use a knife and fork in a controlled way because they've got no stability. So they'll be trying to kneel on their chair, for example, which they might be getting told off about because you don't understand that it's a sensory reason for them to need movement. So making sure their feet can touch the floor or have a box under their feet so that they're supported is really important for fine motor skills, but it's also because they're getting that proprioceptive input. Fidget boxes. This is quite a good thing to do. Is fidgets have got a bit of a bad rap because, you know, people just think of fidget spinners, which a fidget spinner is a visual stimulation. It doesn't do anything in terms of your sort of proprioceptive feedback. Now, the way I was trying to describe it is that you have lots of different hold on, I need to go back a step. If you're driving, if you're going, I don't know, you're driving to Wales, and what happens, I'm just going to have to tell you rather than asking people to give me the answers, but when you start to feel switched off and you're starting to not pay attention, what you do is you feed your sensory systems. So you might wind the window down and you think, oh, that's better. That noise of the air, the feel of it on your face, that makes you feel alert. You think, oh, I'm okay now. And then a few minutes later, you start to feel dozy again. You turn the radio up, you try and sing, you have a drink, you have some sweets. All those things give you another sort of 5-10 minutes of focus, and they all work for a little while, and then you start to think, oh no, I'm not paying any attention again, and then you stop at the service station, and it's not because you needed to spend a fortune on a coffee, and it's not because you needed the toilet, but you gave yourself that proprioceptive input to your muscles and joints, and that alerted you, and you might drive for another hour or two, and then the whole process starts again. Now, this going back to fidgets, this is things like move and sit cushions. I don't know if you've seen those, the wibbly wobbly cushions that children sit on in class, fidget toys. They're all brilliant, but they're a bit like opening the window or turning the radio up. We're not going to expect a child to sit through a whole lesson with just a fidget. Just in the same way as I'm not going to expect you to drive all the way to Scotland just with one packet of Werther's Originals. Okay, so if you think of it from that point of view. So fidget boxes are really important, and having things to fiddle with, but give them at certain times. So if the child needs to say listen for 5 minutes to an instruction, give them something to fidget with then, and then take it away. But don't expect that it's going to work for the whole lesson, and then people will say, oh, well, those fidgets are more distracting. Yes, they're more distracting because their purpose has, you know, it stopped working, and then the child ends up being more engaged with the fidget. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, relaxation strategies are really important. If you just think about the nature of sensory processing, if your senses are on high alert a lot of the time, it totally links in with stress and anxiety levels. So having quiet times, having times to process, but also times to just relax and to dim the lights and to have things quiet, just to give that child a bit of me time. But also it's really important in helping to teach them sensory strategies that work for them. So one of the slides in a minute is around children recognizing their own arousal levels. So for example, we all know if we're feeling a bit stressed, what we might do to help ourselves calm down. I don't know, you might go for a walk, you might do something just to help you, or if you're feeling sleepy, you might make yourself a coffee because you know that's going to keep you alert. Children don't know these things, so we have to find lots of different things. So the child ends up knowing, actually, when I'm feeling really stressed, I know that mum giving me a hand massage really helps me, because they're not going to be able to regulate themselves and change their level of arousal if they haven't got any tools in their toolbox, if they haven't got any strategies that work for them. And they'll only know what those strategies are by experiencing them. The amount of education healthcare plans I've seen that says so-and-so will be able to self-regulate appropriately. And it's like, well, how are they going to be able to self-regulate appropriately without anybody helping them? You know, we've had our whole lives to kind of work out what helps for us. So that's something really important, the relaxation stuff. Sensory diets is a bit of an old term now, but basically that's about those arousal levels. So it's having a balanced diet of sensory input throughout the day that fits your own sensory profile. So if you're somebody who's a bit of a sort of a bit more of a sleepy person that needs a bit more alerting, actually you might find that if you're going into a meeting, you maybe need to go for a little walk first, or you do need the coffee and you do need to go in there with crunchy sweets or something just to keep you alert. Whereas another child might need the same kind of movement to help get all of that sort of frustration out, or to get the sort of the fidgety movement out of them. So that's really important. There's lots of equipment available that work for different things. So the move and sit cushions are the wobbly cushions that can go on chairs. They're really good for children that are real fidget bottoms. But like I said, it's not a move and sit cushion on its own is not going to work for a whole lesson or for a whole meal time. TheraBand, that's like the Pilates band, and you can tie it around the front two legs of the chair, which means they can kick against the chair, against the band, rather than perhaps kicking somebody else under the table. Weighted blankets, I'm sure you've all heard of weighted blankets, in that they're very calming. It's a bit like having a hug. So it's slow, deep pressure. I don't think I mentioned this actually. So if you provide heavy, slow, deep pressure to the body, it has a calming influence on your nervous system. So that's why exercise and movement can help regulate and calm. And that's where hugs will help you calm. And that's where the weighted blankets come in. This flip side of that is anything that's fast and light and tickly is alerting to the nervous system. So, and that goes in much more through your tactile sense. So that's why you get children who can't bear being tickled, or anything light touch, so things like labels in clothes or particular textures really bother them, yet they love a game of rough and tumble. So that's why you get those two different sides of things, because one is too alerting and one is more calming. Therapeutic listening, that's something that we offer here, that you can, there's actually an app you can download for free, and you can purchase tracks, and what that does is it helps to sort of modulate and regulate your sensory systems. For some children it works amazingly well, for other children you don't really notice a difference, but there are lots of children that have really managed certain situations because they listen to tracks that help regulate them and help them calm before they do a particular activity. But the full program could have a big impact on reducing sensitivities and even helping with interoceptive things like recognizing when you need to go to the toilet. So that's something worth Googling if you're interested. Okay, zones of regulation. I just thought I'd mention this. So this is about teaching children to understand their self-regulation, a bit like I said before about getting themselves in the right zone. It's becoming quite common in schools. So you basically have these 4 zones. The green zone is the one where, you know, you're happy, you're focused, you're feeling okay. That's the ideal zone to be in, but none of these zones are wrong. The blue zone is where you're sort of a bit more sleepy and a bit even relaxed, but just sort of more chilled, but also when you're a bit upset as well. The yellow zone is the one to watch, because that's the one where you start to see sort of silly behaviours, loss of control, some excitement. It's really important that we don't stop that, because that's a really important part of, I think that's one of the things that we're all really missing out on at the moment, just having a bit of a laugh and being a bit silly, whether it's in the staff room at work or making jokes with a group of friends. They're all the kind of silly things that are really crucial for human sort of behaviour, really. But they're the bits just to keep an eye out with children, because that's where you're going to go into the red zone. So lots of our children tend to go from green to red very quickly and miss out that bit in the middle. So this is why we need to understand their sensory systems, know what helps, what makes them get angry, what makes them get upset, what are the things they really can't cope with, so we can avoid those, or at least plan for those. So things like having ear defenders if you're going somewhere noisy, it's not ideal, but it's going to help you get through that situation, and they might only get to the yellow zone rather than the red zone and have an almighty meltdown. But it's also about the child understanding what they can do to help themselves. If a child is getting a bit frustrated and a bit anxious about something and they're in the yellow zone and they're really wobbly and it's going to go one way or the other, that's where we need to get in and say, let's go for a walk around the park or something, and you're going to bring them back to the green zone, because when they're in the red zone, they're not going to be able to process what you're saying. That's when you're in full-on tantrum mode, and no matter what you say, they're not going to be able to process that information. So, and particularly if you raise your voice as well. So that's one of the key things as well when you're trying to manage behaviour for whatever reason, whether it's a typical tantrum or whether it's a sensory overload. You've got to keep yourself calm. You've got to try and be in the green zone, even though you don't feel like it. You're in the yellow zone, verging on the red zone yourself. But if you're portraying that, you're not going to help them calm down. And I know that's hard. It's much harder to do than to say. Okay, so and I think we've got 3 slides left, so we're nearly done. So proprioceptive activities is what I said to you before. These are really, really important. This is the muscle stuff. So lots of active, heavy stuff. Lots of children love doing things like pushing wheelbarrows around the garden, sweeping leaves, hoovering, you know, maybe not hoovering if they've got auditory sensitivity, but give them all of those heavy jobs, because often they really like those and they really need that. Lots of people need a lot more sort of resistive movement. So whereas I might think, oh, you know, going and doing 10 wall press ups and 10 star jumps, that would give me enough proprioceptive input. My son, who's 20 with ADHD and is totally sensory proprioceptive seeking, he would need 2 hours in the gym to, you know, to really feel. He needs really intense resistive stuff. So we need to know what the child needs, what works for them. So hobbies, anything that's lots of sports stuff. We've had a lot of problems with children recently, because obviously all of these things that keep them on an even keel, because they do swimming on a Monday night, they do tennis on a Tuesday, and they do Pilates, you know, whatever it might be. All of those things aren't happening. They're not doing their football in the park. So all of the behavioural stuff we're seeing is children are just not getting the chance to get that proprioceptive feedback. My son, certainly when he was little, if Saturday morning football wasn't on for whatever reason, all the other mums would think, oh great, we get to lie in, or we can have a quiet morning. I used to have to walk Isaac like a dog. We'd have to run for a couple of hours, because otherwise he was horrible in the afternoon. If he'd had his 2 hours of football, I could actually know that we'd have quite a chilled afternoon, because he'd sort of, you know, regulated. That was his sensory diet. He needed that movement. Okay, so vestibular activities. If you've got a child that is seeking out, then give them what they're doing. So if you're seeing movement, if you're seeing a child that's jumping a lot, they need that proprioceptive input. If you're seeing a child who's spinning a lot, they need that kind of input. So lots of swinging in the garden. If you can get, if you haven't got a swing, whether they can have a therapy ball and they can roll over the top of it and do lots of bouncing. Any of the sort of hobbies, like things like trampolining and cycling, lots of vestibular. What they say is if it's linear, so if it's in one line, so if it's going side to side or up and down, is very organising. So children that are jumping up and down on trampoline can feel much better afterwards, or children who are running around and around, sort of back and forth in the garden. And you see it in adults with anxiety, you get the pacing and the rocking. All of those things are regulating that vestibular system. What happens is when some children, so the jumping up and down is fine, but if they start to throw themselves around in all different directions on the trampoline, that can be really disorganising and can make them feel more cross and worse. Whereas for some children, actually that doing lots of different movements in different positions and different directions actually helps them. So again, it's working out what's right for your child. Okay, so one child you might put on the trampoline and it's the best thing in the world. For another child, it's actually the worst activity to have, because it's just going to make them feel really disorganized. Okay, and then the tactile stuff. So think about using deep pressure rather than light touch. Think about that light touch being alerting. So some children can't bear being dried after the bath, because that light brushing with the towel, and the more sensitive they are as a parent, the more gentle you're trying to be, or just do it gently, or I'll do it really quickly and we'll get it over with. But actually that's worse. If you almost squeeze them dry in the towel, you're giving pressure rather than doing a quick rub. You're giving pressure, and that will calm them. So I've had some children that won't tolerate being dried, so the parents will wrap them up in their towel and then they pull them all the way into their bedroom along the landing floor wrapped up in the towel. By the time they get there, they're nearly dry and they've had really intense deep pressure movement, which then helps with that calming bedtime routine. Because if you've had the nice calming relaxing bath and you've had the sleepy bath oils and all those kind of things, the child's just feeling settled, and then if you go and rub them briskly with a towel, you're completely alerting their nervous system again, and you've got rid of all the good work. So the deep pressure will help. Other children really need lots of access to lots of different tactile things just to help them calm. You know, some people might like to stroke a bit of a certain type of fabric that helps them to feel calm. Think about the use of weighted things like the blankets again, little jackets. Anyone seen the bear hugs, which is like a it's like a lycra band almost that gives you pressure. It's like a little squeeze belt you can wear. Things like traditional massage. So often children that are really sensitive with their hands, it's the light tickly touch again. So if you get them into a habit of having nice massages, so if you've got to cut fingernails, which is the light tickly touch, which is alerting and they're going to hate, if you give them squeezy hand massage first, and perhaps be squeezing, if you can possibly manage it, squeeze one finger while you cut the nail or get them to squeeze their hands, then the deep pressure is going to override the light tickly touch. Same with brushing hair. Rather than going, oh, I'll do it really gently, if you push your hand on one side really, really firmly and brush firmly with this side, they're much more likely to cope with that because it's the deep pressure and it takes away the light touch. Vibrating massages, that can be really good sometimes because it's really intense deep pressure. And that can help override other things. Often children, even if they don't like light touch, they like things like a vibrating toothbrush because it goes through that proprioceptive sense rather than the tactile sense. Lots of children really need lots of oral motor activity. So you get lots of children that will chew on things. Some children chew all the time. Other children chew when they're getting stressed and anxious. So you might have a child that comes home from school with a soaking wet cuff and holds in a jumper, whereas they don't chew at home. That's a sign that things aren't right in school, and then we need to try and reduce that anxiety in school. I think I'm going to stop now. But yeah, music, just think about music, how it can be calming and organising. Obviously different beats are different for different people, and just be aware of personal taste as well, because what works for me to help me feel hyped up or to help me calm down is going to be very different for somebody else. Just think about the environment in terms of visual stimulation. I'm going to whiz through those. They're on the slides. So, okay. So the important things to remember is that each child is an individual with different sensory processing needs. So we need to recognise what their needs are and what we can do to support them. And the other thing is to see motor, think sensory. So if you're seeing a physical behaviour or activity or something, you can't quite work out what they're doing, think, hold on, is there a sensory need for this? And that can help you in your sort of sensory detective work. Sorry, I've talked at you for nearly the full hour, but I'm more than happy to answer questions. It's very difficult to do it without sort of, I normally do this when it's interactive and people just, you know, ask questions throughout. So
no,
sorry,
brilliant. No, thank you so much. We have just got people that have been commenting about things that you've said and how useful. One lady commented the fact that her son, when you were talking about, let me just read it out. He said, my son needs movement for sensory. Well, he would jump to keep concentrating, always being told off being disruptive. So would then start throwing things and then be very angry. So, really. Melissa, did you want to ask a question? I just saw that you've come in. Hello, Melissa.
Honestly, I'm so frustrated. I'm on this, my daughter's laptop, and I keep trying to email the lady, and it keeps coming up as this. Honestly, I'm not good with laptops and things like this. So if I could have her email address, because I'd like for her to send me some more information if there's any. Can I just ask her? My little one was diagnosed in 2018, and she's only 5 now. We still haven't seen an OT. We've only had in 2.5 years 6 hours of speech and language. No, she's in mainstream reception at the minute. Now, they have asked us to, they're telling us now that they don't think they can have her in year 1 because they don't think they can meet her needs. But I'm so frustrated because I feel like if OT and speech and language was in a hell of a lot more, would she have had that little bit a better chance of kind of going into year 1? And I just feel so frustrated. But is that a normal thing? Can I ask? Is if they can make that decision without an OT coming in? Do you know what I mean? I just feel like I'd love to know, because as I said, it's 2.5 years now and I haven't had anybody come to assess her. Apparently she's on top of the list.
Really hard. Yeah, I'm finding it really hard to understand a lot of it because it's the connection is. So I'm kind of guessing. I'm missing some of the words that you're saying.
Nikki, I can tell you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can.
So Melissa's daughter's 5 in reception, and the school have said that they can't meet her needs to go into year 1.
Right, okay.
But Melissa's concern, and I would be as well, is that her daughter hasn't had any input from an OT or a speech and language therapist. So Melissa's thinking if her daughter had those, her sensory needs met and her speech and language needs met, that she might be able to stay in a mainstream setting, for example. Yeah, is that right, Melissa? Did I get that right?
Yes.
How do they know that they can't meet her needs because they don't actually know what her needs are?
Well, they're saying at the minute that she won't follow their agenda. She won't follow the teacher's agenda at the minute. Only about 20% of it. And that's what they're putting it down to.
Okay.
But everything, honestly, God, everything you've said in all the centuries things, God, she relates to nearly every one of them. Oh. It's crazy. And I just feel like if I had OT come in, I think I would probably have a different outcome for Lottie.
Yeah. Melissa, do you mind me asking you a question? Oh, yeah. Sorry, Nikki, to interrupt. Has your daughter got an EHCP?
Yeah, she has, yes. She got that last February. We've just renewed it now, so I'm just waiting for the results to come back. She has a full-time one-to-one. But I asked them what do they reckon, like what were they thinking? They just think that she needs to go into a special school. But at the minute, I don't know if that's, because that's a massive decision for me and my husband to make. Do you know what I mean? Kind of thing. So, but when she does things in school, she is very clever, like in the respect of like but she's limited talk. That's like, you know what I mean? Like she's not really like she'll tell you all her letters, all her numbers. She can do us counting, all things like that. But when it comes to the social part of it, she struggles.
Okay. I think school cannot say they can't meet her needs when they don't know what her needs are. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. If she hasn't had a speech and language assessment or an OT assessment, how can they say that they can't meet her needs? Because they haven't given themselves the opportunity to know what her needs are and to adapt the environment and adapt the learning for her. If she's got a one-to-one support assistant, then that person is the one that should be taught about this is what her sensory needs are, this is what her communication needs are, this is what help she needs with social skills, for example, and then at least try and support her with that. If that happens and she still can't cope in mainstream, then that would be the point.
I just feel
perhaps a special school.
I just feel that she hasn't been given that, like, what's it called, like that kind of support, like, you know what I mean, like I feel like they're giving up on us too quickly before.
The way I always describe it to teachers is a bit like if you take a child to see an optician and they need glasses, you don't not give them to them. They have those glasses in order to help them follow the curriculum, because otherwise they can't see. Now, if there's some particular things that she needs to help her access learning and they haven't given them to her, they go, oh, I'm not giving her glasses.
Yeah, I understand.
It's the same thing. It's just they don't know what you do.
And I think the frustration from on my behalf is that we're not even a family that can afford a private OT or speech and language. So I think that's...
It sounds like your school may not be the most supportive, but some schools do use their money. I mean, I've gone into, obviously we are a private service, and when we set up, I was really worried about this because we've all got an NHS background and we've all come from somewhere where we've never charged for our services. Obviously, running a company with all the overheads, we've soon realised that actually we do have to charge for our services, and we do an awful lot of stuff for free. But lots of more and more schools are using things like their pupil premium money, and they've got more control over their budgets. So I've got so many schools that have actually paid for me to go in and do an assessment.
Well, when I questioned them that, they said that even though they're giving her a one-to-one, because of the £6,000 they've had to take out their own budget, that there's no money left in their money to pay for anything like that.
Yeah. Have you ever spoken to?
The problem is, I mean, I'm not sort of going. Sorry.
No, go on, Nikki. Sorry, I was going to recommend something to Melissa.
No, yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to.
Because one of the things is they spend the money. No, it's okay. They spend the money on the teaching assistant to be with the child, and nothing against the teaching assistant. They might be the best teaching assistant in the world, but if they don't know the child's needs by being told certain things by an OT or a speech and language therapist, then they're not going to be able to support that child effectively. So lots of the stuff we do, it might be that if she doesn't have a full assessment, but it might be that you can have a really quick assessment that school could fund just for an hour or so, just to be able to give the teaching assistant a bit of training, give them a bit of advice. It might be that, we could go in and say, well, hold on, this classroom is so busy and so overwhelming, it's hardly surprising she can't focus in here. Can you,
it is, because I've even asked for extra, breaks. I've asked for extra breaks, and they've done a risk assessment over the last 2 weeks for her, because she was banging her head like when she was getting frustrated. And when you read through the whole of the risk assessment thing, oh my God, because they've done a diary. Honest to God, from the time she goes to school, they've literally.
The banging her head is a sure sign that
for me, it's very busy. It's too busy for her.
Yeah.
Because they're not giving her the regular breaks.
Banging in the head is a proprioceptive thing. So it's a really intense form of proprioception, which she could probably get in a better way by moving, but if they're telling her not to move.
Yeah.
But it's also a sign that things aren't going well. So
no, I know.
She shouldn't have got to that.
Yeah, but listen, thank you so much. Honestly, I really appreciate it.
No, that's fine.
Even though she was diagnosed two and a half years ago, I'm still learning.
My handouts.
I'm still learning, so thank you.
I've got some handouts that might help you as well, Melissa. Did you say you couldn't send us your email? Because if you can't, stay on at the end and I'll take it from you so that I write it down.
Are you the lady that answers the private messages on Facebook?
Oh, that's Way. So that's good. If you're in touch with Way, that's fine.
Well, I sent her the email even then.
Okay, perfect.
Because I don't know how to do it. Honestly, these computers are not very good.
No. And just one more thing, and then we'll go on to the questions. But there's a service called Sendias, which you may not have come across. We'll make sure you've got their details, but they'll support you in helping you to work out the right. They're like advocacy, so they'll help you work out what's the best route for your daughter to go down. And if it's a parent's wish to stay in mainstream, then she should try to stay in mainstream with. So we'll help you with that, because the law is very clear around that. So we'll give you some guidance, Melissa.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please, if anyone else has got a question, Kaylee, would you like? Hi, Kaylee.
Hello, hiya.
Yeah,
I'm just actually, my son attended the same school as Melissa's daughter, actually.